But you have not so learned Christ, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that you put off concerning your former conduct, the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness.
Good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get a Bible out. Let's get it over to Ephesians chapter 6. If you're using a pew Bible, you can find that in the pew in front of you. That'll be on page 1800, so go ahead and get one of those out, and you'll be able to follow along with us. We're glad that you're here. We're thankful if you're visiting with us. Please stick around afterwards. We'd love to talk to you a little bit more, get to know about you, find out what brought you in today. And we also just want to make way of invitation to come back next Sunday as well. Our congregation is doing what we call an Everyone Bring One service, and so we're going to invite all the visitors that we can to be here next Sunday. So just a reminder to our members to make sure that you're inviting people this week to come and be a part of that this next Sunday. Again, thank you all for being here and being willing to take some time to think about God's Word. You know, in our reading that we just looked at in Ephesians chapter 4, one of the things that was emphasized in it is that if we call ourselves Christians, we're supposed to be very different. If we call ourselves a new creation, then that means I have cast off some things that I used to be. That means that everything about me has changed. And I want to open up this morning by using a phrase you might have heard me use before about the gospel. I think one of the things we learn about the gospel itself is that the gospel is by nature confrontational. It's confrontational whenever it comes to my own life. It's confrontational whenever it considers the way that I walk and the direction that I go. That's something that Paul's been emphasizing in chapter 4 and chapter 5. The gospel confronts how I view the body of Christ and the fact that I'm a part of it. He talks about that in chapter 4 with the oneness idea. But it also, maybe the bigger point in Ephesians, is that the gospel of Jesus Christ confronts my sin. And it confronts some concrete changes that I need to make. And we looked at several of those already in this series. In chapter 4, we saw that we have to put off lying. In chapter 4, we've got to put off our anger and our temper. It cannot get the better of us. We have to put off stealing. We have to put off sexual immorality. We have to put off drunkenness. There's all of these things that change about me because I am now a new creation. But in the section that we're going to be in today, and that we were in last month as well, shows us that the gospel of Jesus Christ also confronts my relationships. It confronts how I view myself in certain relationships. For instance, if you remember back in chapter 5 in verse 21, Paul concluded that section by saying that we ought to submit to one another in the fear of Christ. I'm no longer just my own person, but I'm accountable to other people. And they're accountable to me. There's this relationship that I've entered into now with Christ and His people, and that I now have to submit to other people. We talked about that last time. Not only that, but in verses 22 to 33, if I'm a Christian, if I'm a new creature, then it matters how I conduct myself in my marriage. It matters how I act as a husband. It matters how I act as a wife. Jesus cares about that deeply. And in our lesson today, we're going to look at a few other relationships that Paul decides to point out for us. He's going to talk about parents and children, masters and slaves. And so why don't we go ahead and just look at what Paul has to say about that by reading our entire text for this morning. Look with me at Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, because this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may have a long life in the land. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your human masters with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as you would Christ. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, to do God's will from your heart. Serve with a good attitude as to the Lord and not to people, knowing that whatever good each one does, slave or free, he will receive this back from the Lord. And masters, treat your slaves the same way, without threatening them, because you know that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. We're going to go in the order that Paul chose to go in this morning, if that's okay. We're just going to begin by talking about what Paul has to say to the children about how they should act to their parents. And I think Paul addresses something on the top end of this that shows you he was around children. Because there is a tendency in all of our children, when we tell them something to do, that they ask one question: why? And Lillian's going through this phase, and it's been fun because you'll give an answer, and then there's another why on the other end of that. And eventually that why turns into because I said so, right? That's a well-rehearsed thing, and I would imagine people's homes. But you learn that really carries a lot of authority with it as a parent, because I said so. But ultimately, the answer to the why is because it's right. That's what God desires. You obey children because it's the right thing to do. You listen to mom and dad because God is telling you to. At its core, that is, I believe, what's going on here. And I think it's right in two ways, though. I do think it's right in the natural order of things. And I want all the kids to look up here and listen at me. If you're still in your parents' house, you count as a kid in this particular case. I want you to listen to what I'm going to say here. Paul says that you need to obey your parents because it's right for two reasons. Number one, it's right in the natural order of things. And what I mean by that is that your parents know more than you do. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember. And the Bible will talk about this. For instance, in the book of Proverbs, over and over again, Solomon is trying to give instruction and teaching to who? His children. He's trying to show them, hey, there are some life experiences that I've been through, and so I want to share what some of those have been with you. So, even as early as Proverbs 1 and verse 10, Solomon will say, my son, if sinners entice you, don't be persuaded. Why is Solomon saying this to his sons? Well, he's seen it before. He's likely been a part of it. A little bit later in chapter 3 and verse 3, he'll say, never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. Tie them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Verse 1, don't forget my teaching, my son. He knows something here. Verse 3 in specific, how many unloyal people had Solomon seen in his life? So now he wants to pass this life experience down to his children. In chapter 4 and verses 1 through 9, he begins to address what the path of the wicked looks like. Your parents have seen people take this road. They have seen people that they have been very close to choose roads like this before. And so when they're giving you warnings, it's because it's based off of their experience. In chapter 5 and 7, he'll address women to his sons or relationships. In chapter 6, he addresses money. And you get to a point when you hear your parents lecturing you about these things, and you just want to ask, well, how do they know all of this? Where did they obtain all this? They probably went through it. Maybe made some mistakes of their own. And so inherently, because your parents are older, because they've been on this earth for longer, they know more. And it's the right thing for you to do to listen to them. So it's not only right in the natural order of things, it is right in command. You obey your parents because God is telling you to. And so when you disobey your parents, you're disobeying God. Now, Jesus echoes how important this is in Mark chapter 7. But, Paul, before he even quotes, or before he even references, before you even get to the idea of Jesus emphasizing this, he goes all the way back to the Old Testament to make this point in verse 2. That you are to honor your father and mother. Well, that goes back to the 10 Commandments. This is right there in them. Honor your father and your mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, Jesus will echo this in Mark chapter 7. This is one of the 10 Commandments that the Pharisees had decided to set aside in the light of following their traditions. But Paul reassures us here that if we're willing to honor our mother and our father and our youth as children, it brings out blessing is what it does. Did you see how he quoted that in verse 3, that it may go well with you in the land and you may have a long life in the land? The promise that's attached to obedience to our parents is a long life. And why is that? Because if you're willing to listen to the advice that your parents are giving you, It will spare you of a lot of unnecessary pain and sorrow. Oh, how many of us can look back on a time in our life where we wished we had heeded the advice of our mom and dad. And so I think this is true physically and spiritually. Physically, our parents are giving us commands all the time for like our well-being and our safety. You know, hey, don't cross the road. Stop. Pay attention to where you're going. They can see things that are coming that our kids just can't see. But that's true spiritually as well. Your parents, because of their experience, have foresight. They have the ability to a certain degree, look in the future. To see, okay, if you choose this road, here's going to be the outcome. And so listen to their warnings when they're giving them to you. What it's going to do is not only spare your physical life, but your spiritual well-being too. Listen to them. They're giving you good advice. Now, in the next section, in verse 4, Paul goes on to address fathers to the children. Sorry, that should say in verse 4. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. I love how he starts here. Two questions on this. Number one, why does Paul say this specifically to fathers? Don't stir up anger. Why aren't the mothers on the table here? Because when is someone most likely to stir up anger in another person? It's when they're angry themselves. And I think this is a trait that is true of all people, but especially men and especially fathers, that we get to a point where our kids aren't listening, so I'm just going to bully my way through it. And what I think I'm doing is parenting, but what I'm actually doing is I'm just stirring up anger in them. And I'm not really accomplishing what I think I'm accomplishing with them. All I'm doing is just trying to move my weight around so that they do what it is that I want. This is a temptation for men. And I think there are a number of ways in which fathers are guilty of this idea of stirring up anger in our children. I think it's when we overly parent. Do you all know what I mean by that? Probably be good for me to explain it. When we spend too much time or so much time instructing that we begin to communicate to them that we don't trust them and that we need to micromanage every aspect of their life to force them to make the right choices. What that communicates to the kid is that we don't trust that they will choose to do the right thing. And I believe that frustrates kids. When we don't give them the space to obey, when we don't give them the space to even fail sometimes. We need to be mindful that the way we treat our kids matters in the eyes of God. And so if we're stirring up anger in them unnecessarily, fathers, we need to take that really seriously. We need to find a better way to communicate to them if all we're doing is stirring up anger. Now, the other end of this is to bring them up in two things. First is training in the Lord. What's interesting is this word to bring them up is the same word that was used for nourish or provide back in chapter 5 and verse 29, when it was talking about the husband needing to provide for his wife the same way he nourishes himself. It's the same word. And so just taking that very literally, do you feed your kid physically every day? We make that a priority. Well, they got to eat. We got to give them food. Well, what spiritual food are you giving your kids every day? Because that's what Paul has in mind here, is not just physical nourishment, true spiritual nourishment that comes in the form of training in the Lord. There's another word for training I like to use, and that is the word discipline. And I'm not talking about discipline in terms of getting, punishment. I do think that is an aspect of discipline. But discipline in terms of someone who is training for a sport and is trying to prepare for something big. And how good are we at getting our kids to all the practices they need to be to get to sports and whatever? But are we preparing them for the biggest race that they're going to run in their life? The Christian race? That's my job. That's the kind of discipline and training that I need to be giving them. What spiritual regimen is my child on? Are we careful to make sure that we're giving them the discipline they need so that they can learn what they need to? Because let me tell you something confidently. Just bringing them here on Sundays and Wednesdays is not enough for their spiritual regimen. They need you, fathers at home, to teach them and instruct them in the Lord. And so that's the second side. It's not just the training and discipline, but the instruction side. Bring them up in the instruction of the Lord. The word instruction just means to call attention to. This gets back to that idea in Proverbs. That there are things I've seen in my life that I want to lift up in front of my kids and say, hey, I went through this when I was your age. Please watch out for this. I'm calling your attention to it. And you know, what that really shows a child is that you love them. Because you don't want them to go through the same mistakes you did. You show me a child that you decide to leave to their own devices and to make their own mistakes, I'll show you a child you don't truly love. If you love your kids, you'll warn them. It will be up to them to listen. It will be up to them to make changes in their own life. But it'll be ultimately up to them. So warn them, help them, and pay attention. We're going to move into the next section, verses 5 through 9. And let's go ahead and read this section again. Slaves, obey your human masters with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as you would Christ. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, do God's will from your heart. Serve with a good attitude as to the Lord and not to people, knowing that whatever good each one does, slave or free, he will receive this back from the Lord. And masters, treat your slaves the same way without threatening them, because you know that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. You know, in this section that we're going to talk about, Paul brings up a unique part, but very real part of other people's lives in this day. And that is the relationship that was between masters and slaves. Now, this is a fact that we cannot overlook if we are going to be good students of the Bible. Many of God's people throughout Bible history were, in fact, slaves in one capacity or another. And there were varied reasons why people would end up becoming a slave. It could have been born into it. It could have been because paying off a debt, or it could have been because you were kidnapped. So because of that and because of what we're talking about, I think it's important for us to just take a step back for a second and consider what the Bible has to say about slavery. And I think it's an important as we enter into this section, to clear up any misconceptions concerning this very topic. Because many people, when this kind of conversation comes up, this particular topic is used as an opportunity to discredit the Bible. But I believe when you really look at this topic in the Bible, the way that it's written and the way that it's talked about as a whole, it paints a picture of freedom, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And so we're going to look at this section, even in the light of our own country's misguided and totally horrific mistakes, and acknowledge that that time in our country's history was really not that long ago. And among so-called Christians during that time period, the Bible was used as a prop to try and justify that kind of horrific behavior, to kidnap others and enslave them, and all other kinds of cruel treatment. But what we're going to learn is that the Bible does not commend or encourage the behavior that this country experienced 150 years ago. And so with that in mind, I want us to consider three things before we dig into this section. Number one, think about slavery from the perspective of Genesis and Exodus. Right now, you're going through the story of Joseph back in the back classroom. Joseph was enslaved, sold by his own brothers and given into it. And eventually what happened when his family got there, all of God's people ended up becoming slaves in Egypt. But where does the whole Bible story begin? It begins with God setting free the slaves. God giving them an opportunity for freedom, to bless them, to bring them into his land. God was willing to release them. God intervened. Now, another thing I think we have to understand, especially about slavery in the Old Testament, is that it was incredibly regulated in the law. In Leviticus 25, you can go home and read this. This is what was called the year of Jubilee. And it outlines for us different times where the slaves would be set free. Not only that, but there are different passages in the book of Exodus where it says whoever kidnaps a person must be put to death, whether he sells them or the person is found in his possession. This was not tolerated. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, do not return a slave to his master when he has escaped from his master to you. Let him live among you wherever he wants within your city gates. Do not mistreat him. The Israelites were instructed to take in fugitives. Now, one thing I will note about this. In all of the old law, there are extremely difficult passages that I did not cite this morning. But I am reminded of something that Jesus said in Matthew the 19th chapter. Whenever the Pharisees came to Jesus and they questioned him concerning divorce, do you remember what Jesus said why divorce was permitted? It was for the hardness of the Israelites' heart. And I just wonder how many things in the old law would also fit that category and fit that bill. How many things were permitted but were not God's original will? You know, that lines up to me. Because when you push your way into the New Testament, there is one fact that you cannot escape. That slavery could not persist if people were following the New Testament teachings. In fact, Paul condemns this in 1 Timothy 1 and verse 10. He puts it in a list of really horrific sins. The sexually immoral, males who have sex with males, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound teaching. And not only that, you have the whole book of Philemon as well. A story where a runaway slave, Onesimus, is sent back to his master, Philemon. And it's really fascinating to watch the way Paul uses the way Paul uses his words in that little letter. Because he doesn't emphasize that Onesimus is Philemon's slave. What he instead emphasizes is that this is your brother. So, with all that being said, I do want us to take our attention to verses 5 through 8. Because in our section today, Paul does not concern himself with how someone found themselves in this situation or in this relationship, a master and a slave, much like he does not with marriage. Many of the marriages then were arranged. Paul doesn't concern himself with how you got married. If this is the circumstance you're in, this is what you're expected to do. But it might be good for our own application this morning as we look at this to be thinking of our own relationships as both employers and employees. I think there are appropriate applications that can be made there. But in Paul's words, we might be able to understand what he's getting at. That through our own circumstances and how we act, Christ can still be seen. So coming back to verse 5, slaves, obey your human masters with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart. Why? As slaves of Christ, as you would Christ. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, do God's will from your heart. There's this encouragement to obey with sincerity of heart. There ought to be respect and fear, as well as a true, genuine sincerity to want to serve your master. Paul also tells us down in verse 7 that we ought to be willing to serve with a good attitude. But notice what he says, as to the Lord and not to people. I would imagine if this were your position, it would be really easy to be jaded, frustrated, upset. But Paul says we have to watch our attitude, to work hard regardless of who is looking. You know, we look at these two things and we ask, how could any one person do something like this? That would be so difficult. But do you see what Paul does in both of these verses? He says, instead of thinking about serving your human master, you think about the fact that you're serving Jesus Christ. You think about yourself as a slave of Christ. And so in verse 8, he concludes to them by saying, knowing that whatever good each one does, slave or free, he will receive this back from the Lord. You know, I think, again, another wonderful example of this exact principle is in the character and in the story of Joseph. Somebody who determined, even though he has been sold into slavery, that he is going to do the right thing. And he submits even to the will of what Pharaoh is, but he never breaks his covenant with God first and foremost. In this relationship between master and slave, he also tells us, not only is Joseph a good example of that, but look at verse 9. He says, and masters, treat your slaves the same way without threatening them, because you know that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Did you notice how he said that at the beginning of verse 9? Masters, treat your slaves the same way. Well, what way? What's he just told the slaves? You treat them with sincerity of heart. Back in verse 8, he said, it doesn't matter if slave or free, you will receive the same that you give in goodness back from the Lord. Isn't that interesting? Paul is holding both masters and slaves to the same exact standard. And he gives them a reminder here that their master and yours is in heaven. This ought to be humbling the master when he reads something like this. You are not the top dog. Jesus Christ is the top dog. It's not you. And furthermore than that, God shows no favoritism. In this relationship between the master and slave, God only sees one kind of person. He sees a soul. That's who God is looking at. And brethren, let me show you how the New Testament multiplies that over and over and over again. In Galatians 3:28, there is no Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male and female, since you are all one in Christ Jesus, and if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to promise. In 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 13, for we were all baptized by one Spirit into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all given one Spirit to drink. And again in Colossians 3, in Christ there is not Greek and Jew, circumcision and uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. Do you see the point? Brethren, this would have been a relatively earth-shattering thing to have said to a pagan in this day. That in Jesus Christ church, there is no slave, there is no free man. All are one in Jesus Christ. In Jesus, we have this reconciliation between all men. And that is what makes, I think, this teaching on slaves and masters really so beautiful. It's because Paul is teaching something that's never been taught, showing a way that has never been done before. But it will be up to us if we will yield. So in all of these relationships, I believe there is one thing to learn. When people see me apply these principles in my circumstance, they will see my love and loyalty to Christ. Again, we begin with just the children. When the world is able to see children who obey their parents, and they do so lovingly and not begrudgingly, they see children who, when they become teenagers, don't backtalk their parents and don't talk behind their backs, but praise their parents to others and tell them how much they love them. You know what the other people are going to be able to see in you, kids? They're going to be able to see Jesus Christ himself and your love and loyalty and dedication to him. Mothers and fathers, when they see you loving your kids the way that you're supposed to, consistently disciplining them in a way that's effective and follows the advice of the Bible. When they see how well disciplined your kids are and that they respect all people, you know what they're going to be able to see? They're going to be able to see Christ. And employers, if you're somebody who is incredibly patient with your employees, somebody who's incredibly gracious and generous and always doing what you can to serve them and to sacrifice with them, you know what they're going to be able to see? They're going to be able to see Jesus. And for those of us who are employees, if I'm somebody who, when I work for my employer, I'm very consistent and good-hearted and eager, and I come in every day with a good attitude, you know what your employer is eventually going to ask? Why are you this way? Because no one else is. And you're going to be able to say, it's because I serve Jesus Christ. The way I act in these relationships matters. They matter in my marriage, they matter in my parenting relationship, and they matter at work. Will I be the new creation that Jesus is calling me to be? Thank you all for good patience this morning. I want to talk about that idea of being a slave of Christ for just a second. You know, Paul borrows that same imagery in Romans chapter 6 when he makes the suggestion that there are really only two kinds of slaves we can be. We can either be a slave of sin or we can be a slave of Christ. And if you're a slave of sin this morning, let me reassure you, it is the cruelest master you will ever have. If you're willing to seek freedom in Jesus Christ this morning by believing in him, repenting, and being baptized, let me tell you, he is the best master any of us have ever had. And we look forward to the day that we get to serve him in all eternity. But if you're somebody who's walked away from Jesus as your master and as your Lord, we implore you and we beg you to make that right. Come back to him today. If we can help you in any way, you can come down to the front as we stand and sing.